You've been using the wrong syrup your whole life. Most people think maple is the only syrup worth pouring on pancakes. But hidden across North America are trees producing syrups almost nobody has ever tasted. Let's start with the one that surprises people the most. Ask a group of firewood cutters what they think about black walnut, and you'll probably hear more complaints than compliments. It stains your hands. It can kill nearby garden plants. And splitting a twisted walnut log can test your patience faster than a dull chainsaw. But here's what surprised me. The same tree that causes all that trouble also makes one of the richest syrups you'll ever taste. Unlike maple syrup, black walnut syrup isn't all about sweetness. It has a deep, nutty flavor with hints of caramel and vanilla. Some people even compare it to a fine bourbon without the alcohol. It is the kind of syrup that feels more at home on roasted vegetables, smoked meats, or aged cheese than on a stack of pancakes. The tree itself usually starts flowing a little later than sugar maples. That means if you already tap maples, you can often extend your syrup season by switching to black walnut once the maples slow down. That alone makes it interesting for small producers. Now, don't expect huge yields. Black walnut still takes around 40 gallons of sap to produce 1 gallon of syrup, so every bottle represents a lot of work. Then again, most good things in the woods do. Firewood doesn't split itself, and syrup certainly doesn't boil itself either. Funny enough, I've met people who cut down black walnut because they were tired of cleaning up the nuts every fall. If only they knew, they might have been cutting down one of the most interesting syrup trees on their property. But if you think that's unusual, the next tree is even harder to figure out. It doesn't follow the normal tapping rules at all, and that's exactly what makes it so fascinating. If black walnut is rich and forgiving, birch is the complete opposite. Birch trees make you earn every single drop. The first surprise is timing. You don't tap birch at the same time as maple. The sap usually starts flowing after the maple season is already coming to an end. For many syrup makers, that's a welcome bonus, because it stretches the season instead of replacing it. Then reality hits. Birch sap contains much less sugar than maple sap. Depending on the species and growing conditions, it can take well over 100 gallons of sap to produce a single gallon of finished syrup. That means more collecting, more boiling, and a lot more firewood feeding the evaporator. No wonder many producers try it once and decide maple suddenly doesn't seem like so much work after all. The flavor is another surprise. If you're expecting something sweet enough to pour over pancakes, you might be disappointed. Birch syrup is darker, bolder, and slightly tangy, with notes of caramel, molasses, and spice. Many chefs actually prefer using it in savory dishes, especially on salmon, pork, or roasted vegetables. And here's something most people never think about. A healthy birch tree might spend decades growing quietly in your backyard without anyone realizing it could produce something so unique. Most people only see white bark. Syrup makers see weeks of hard work and a bottle that's unlike anything you'll find on an ordinary grocery store shelf. Still, as demanding as birch is, the next tree proves that rarity can make a syrup even more special. Finding one healthy enough to tap has become the biggest challenge of all. Some trees are hard to find because they grow in remote places, but butternut is becoming hard to find for a much sadder reason. A disease called butternut canker has been killing these beautiful trees across North America for decades. Healthy, mature butternuts are becoming harder to find every year, and anyone lucky enough to have one should appreciate it. If you've never heard of a butternut tree, you're not alone. It's often called the white walnut because it's closely related to black walnut, although it's usually lighter in color and produces smaller nuts with a milder flavor. Its syrup follows the family tradition. Rich, smooth, and slightly nutty, but with a lighter, buttery finish that many people describe as delicate rather than bold. It doesn't try to compete with maple. It has its own personality. Like many alternative syrup trees, butternut asks for patience. You still need a large amount of sap to make a single gallon of syrup, and because healthy trees are becoming so uncommon, very few producers make it commercially. That makes every bottle feel a little special. I've always believed a forest tells its own history if you're willing to pay attention. A dying ash reminds you of emerald ash borers. Chestnut stumps remind you of a tree that once dominated eastern forests. And butternut quietly reminds us that not every tree disappearing makes the evening news. Here's the funny part though. The next tree isn't disappearing at all. In fact, If you live in the Pacific Northwest, you might walk under one every day without realizing it's capable of making excellent syrup. And unlike butternut, its biggest feature is impossible to miss. Its leaves are absolutely enormous. When people hear maple syrup, they usually picture Vermont or Canada. But head to the Pacific Northwest, and you'll find another maple that's been quietly making syrup for generations. Big leaf maple lives up to its name. Its leaves can grow bigger than a dinner plate, making them the largest of any maple in North America. You almost can't mistake one once you've seen it. The syrup is different too. It has a rich caramel flavor, with a softer finish than traditional maple syrup. Some people even say it carries a hint of butterscotch, although every batch depends on the weather, the soil, and even the individual tree. That's one thing I've learned over the years. Trees are a lot like people. Two neighbors can grow up on the same road and still have completely different personalities. Trees aren't much different. Two big leaf maples standing 20 yards apart can produce syrup that tastes surprisingly different. The climate plays a big role as well. Instead of the long, cold winters found in the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest has milder temperatures and plenty of rain. That changes when the sap begins to flow and gives local syrup makers a season that's a little different from what most people expect. It's also a good reminder that valuable trees aren't just hiding in famous maple country. Sometimes they're growing right where you live, quietly ignored because everyone assumes syrup only comes from somewhere else. But while big leaf maple is still part of the maple family, the next tree throws that idea completely out the window. Its syrup isn't known for sweetness at all. In fact, most people are shocked the first time they taste it. It tastes more like something you'd pour over a steak than a stack of pancakes. If I handed you a spoonful of sycamore syrup with your eyes closed, there's a good chance you wouldn't even guess it was syrup. Most people expect sweetness. Sycamore has other ideas. Instead of tasting like breakfast, it leans toward rich caramel, toasted nuts, and a deep, earthy flavor that surprises almost everyone the first time they try it. Some people even pick up hints of mushrooms or roasted vegetables, which sounds strange until you actually taste it. That's exactly why chefs love it. While maple syrup usually ends up on pancakes or waffles, sycamore syrup often finds its way onto pork, duck, salmon, or roasted vegetables. It adds sweetness, but it also brings depth that ordinary maple simply can't match. The tree itself is hard to miss. Its bark peels away in patches, leaving a mix of white, gray, and olive colors underneath. From a distance, it almost looks like camouflage. Once you learn to recognize a sycamore, you'll start spotting them everywhere, especially along rivers and streams where they thrive. Like several trees on this list, timing matters. The sap usually begins flowing after maple season, when warm days and freezing nights create the right conditions. Miss that short window, and you'll have to wait another year. That's something the woods teach you pretty quickly. Nature doesn't work on your schedule. You work on hers. I've learned that lesson more than once, and trust me, the trees don't care if you overslept. But as unusual as sycamore syrup is, the next one surprises people for a completely different reason. Because it isn't made by tapping the tree at all. In fact, you never drill a single hole in it. By now you've probably noticed a pattern. Find the right tree, drill a small hole, collect the sap, boil it down. Well, Hickory decided to ignore that rule completely. Instead of tapping the tree, traditional hickory syrup is made from the bark. That surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. It certainly surprised me. After spending years around hickory trees, I always thought of them as some of the toughest hardwoods in the forest. Great firewood, fantastic tool handles, excellent smoking wood. Syrup never even crossed my mind. The process starts by collecting loose bark without harming the tree. The bark is washed, lightly roasted, then soaked in hot water to pull out its rich, smoky flavor. After that, it's strained, sweetened, and slowly reduced until it becomes a thick, dark syrup. It's an old Appalachian tradition that's been passed down for generations. The flavor is unlike anything else on this list. Imagine maple syrup spending the weekend around a campfire. You get rich caramel notes, a little vanilla, a touch of smoke, and just enough sweetness to make it work on everything from pancakes to barbecue ribs. Honestly, if someone served it over smoked brisket instead of breakfast, I wouldn't question it for a second. That's what makes learning about trees so enjoyable. Just when you think you've figured them out, one comes along and completely changes the rules. And speaking of changing the rules, the next tree comes with a built-in security system. Most people avoid it because of the enormous thorns. Turns out, those thorns have been protecting something surprisingly sweet all along. If you've ever walked too close to a honey locust, chances are you remember it. Not because of the leaves, because of the thorns. Some of them can grow several inches long, sharp enough to puncture a tractor tire or ruin your day in a hurry. It's almost like the tree is warning you to keep your distance. But once you get past those thorns, you discover something completely unexpected. Honey locust has been valued for centuries because of its long seed pods, filled with a naturally sweet pulp. Long before refined sugar was common, people chewed the pods for a quick taste of sweetness, and later discovered they could be turned into a rich syrup. Unlike most of the trees we've talked about, this one isn't tapped for sap. Instead, the pods are harvested when they're fully mature, the sweet pulp is separated, and it's slowly cooked into syrup. It's a completely different process, but the result is just as fascinating. The flavor is often described as somewhere between honey, brown sugar, and molasses, with a light floral finish that makes it surprisingly smooth. Nature has a funny sense of humor. One of the friendliest tasting syrups comes from one of the least friendly trees in the woods. I've always thought that's a good reminder not to judge a tree by its bark, or in this case by its thorns. But here's something even more surprising. The next tree doesn't need giant thorns to keep people away. Most people simply ignore it because they don't think it's worth much at all. That might be the biggest mistake on this entire list. If you've ever heard someone call a tree junk, there's a good chance they were talking about boxelder. It grows fast. Its branches snap easily in storms, and firewood cutters usually don't get very excited when they see one. But here's the funny thing. Boxelder is actually a maple. Most people never realize that because it doesn't look much like the classic maples famous for their brilliant fall colors. In fact, it's the only maple in North America with compound leaves, which makes it easy to mistake for an ash tree if you don't know what you're looking for. That little detail has fooled plenty of people over the years. Since it's part of the maple family, you can tap it just like other maples. The sap usually contains less sugar, so you'll spend more time boiling, but it still produces a perfectly good syrup with a mild, clean flavor. For someone with a few boxelders growing around the house, it's a fun way to discover that an ordinary tree can do something extraordinary. I've always liked trees that surprise people. The famous ones get all the attention, but it's often the overlooked trees that have the best stories. Boxelder is proof of that. Most people see a tree that's barely worth cutting for firewood. A syrup maker sees another harvest waiting for spring. And speaking of overlooked trees, the next one is so common that millions of people walk past it every single day without giving it a second thought. Yet every spring, it quietly produces one of the lightest and most delicate syrups in the forest. Basswood isn't the kind of tree that usually grabs your attention. It doesn't have massive nuts like walnut. It doesn't grow dangerous thorns like honey locust. And nobody stops their truck just to admire a basswood tree. But bees certainly do. When basswood begins flowering, the sweet fragrance can fill an entire section of the forest. Beekeepers know exactly what that means. Some even move their hives close to basswood stands because the blossoms produce excellent nectar for honey. It turns out people aren't the only ones with a sweet tooth. The tree has another hidden talent. Basswood can also produce syrup with a light, delicate flavor that's completely different from the darker syrups we've talked about so far. Instead of bold caramel notes, this one is clean, floral, and slightly honey-like, making it one of the gentlest syrups you'll ever taste. The downside is simple. Basswood sap doesn't contain much natural sugar, so collecting enough to make syrup takes plenty of patience. Most commercial producers skip it entirely because there are easier trees to work with. That's a shame. Sometimes the most rewarding things aren't the easiest ones. I've always believed the woods reward people who slow down enough to notice the little details. Whether it's spotting fresh deer tracks, finding the first morel mushrooms of spring, or realizing an ordinary-looking basswood has more to offer than anyone gives it credit for. Funny how often the quiet ones surprise you, but the next tree doesn't stay quiet for long. In fact, it's becoming harder to find every single year, and its story is one every forest lover should know. Beech trees don't need bright fall colors or giant seed pods to stand out. Once you learn to recognize their smooth, silver-gray bark, you'll never mistake them for anything else. Even in the middle of winter, when every other hardwood looks nearly the same, a mature beech seems to glow among the trees. They've always struck me as some of the most elegant trees in the forest. Strong, quiet, never in a hurry. And hidden beneath that smooth bark is another syrup that most people have never tasted. Beech syrup has a light sweetness with delicate notes of honey and toasted butter. It isn't loud or overpowering. It's one of those flavors that slowly grows on you, and before long you find yourself reaching for another taste just to figure it out. Tapping beech isn't always straightforward, though. Unlike some other trees, the sap flow can be unpredictable. One spring a tree may produce surprisingly well, while the following year it barely gives you enough sap to justify hanging the bucket. That's just part of working with nature. The trees make the rules. We simply learn them. Sadly, beech faces another challenge today. Across much of North America, a disease known as beech leaf disease has been spreading, weakening, and killing countless trees. Researchers are still working to understand it, and many healthy-looking beeches can decline much faster than anyone expected. It's a reminder that forests are never standing still. They're constantly changing, whether we notice it or not. I've spent enough years in the woods to know one thing. You appreciate a tree a lot more once you realize it might not always be there. But our next tree couldn't be more different. It's still standing strong across huge parts of North America, and every spring it quietly produces one of the boldest syrups you'll ever taste. In fact, many people say it's the closest thing to a gourmet sauce hiding inside a tree. Most people hear the word pecan and immediately think about pie. Can't blame them. It's probably the tree's biggest claim to fame. But spend enough time around pecan trees, and you start to realize they're good for a lot more than filling dessert plates. Pecan belongs to the hickory family, and like its cousin, it has a rich history that goes far beyond the grocery store. While pecan syrup isn't nearly as common as maple or walnut, people have experimented with both the sap and the naturally sweet parts of the tree for generations, especially across the southern United States. That alone makes it worth talking about. Sometimes the most interesting trees aren't the ones producing thousands of gallons every year. They're the ones proving there's still plenty left to discover. The flavor is exactly what you'd expect from a pecan tree. Rich, nutty, smooth. There's a gentle caramel sweetness that reminds you of roasted pecans without being overpowering. It feels familiar, but different enough that you'd never mistake it for maple. I like that. Too many people spend their lives comparing everything to maple syrup. The better question is this: what makes each tree unique? That's what keeps the woods interesting. Every species has its own story, its own strengths, its own little surprises. And after spending years cutting firewood, milling logs, and walking through forests, I've learned that the trees people ignore are often the ones that teach you the most. That's really what this video has been about all along. Not just syrup. Looking at familiar trees with fresh eyes. Because once you know what they're capable of, you'll never walk through the woods quite the same way again. By now, some of you are probably thinking, what about the tree growing in my backyard? Fair question. Let's run through a few of the ones people ask me about the most. Oak comes up all the time. Yes, you can tap an oak tree, but there's very little reward for all the effort. The sap contains so little sugar that turning it into syrup just isn't practical. If you've got an oak, I'd leave it to producing acorns and some excellent firewood. Then there's ash. I've been around plenty of ash trees over the years, especially before the emerald ash borer started wiping them out. People occasionally ask if they can make syrup from them too. Technically, you can collect sap from almost any tree in spring, but ash simply doesn't produce enough sugar to make it worthwhile. Apple trees are another popular question. People assume that because the fruit is sweet, the sap must be sweet too. Unfortunately, trees don't work that way. Apple sap contains very little sugar, so making syrup from it isn't something you'll see many people doing. And then there's pine. Believe it or not, I've heard that question more than once. What drips out of a pine tree isn't the kind of syrup you want on your pancakes. That's resin, and while it's useful for plenty of things, breakfast isn't one of them. The truth is, hundreds of tree species move sap every spring. Only a small number produce enough sugar, or enough unique flavor, to be worth turning into syrup. And honestly, I think that makes them even more interesting. Because the next time someone tells you syrup only comes from maple, you'll know the forest has been keeping a few delicious secrets all along. Maple syrup will probably always be the most famous, and that's perfectly fine. But hopefully the next time you walk through the woods, you'll see more than just firewood or shade. Every one of these trees has its own story, and sometimes the best discoveries are hiding in places we've walked past for years. If you learned something new today, consider subscribing. There's plenty more the forest still has to teach us.